If you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes the truth. And this week, that lie crossed an ocean. The United States just accepted 49 South Africans, the so-called Afrikaners, as refugees. Yes, you heard that right. Refugees, fleeing what they call persecution. In today's episode, we will talk about who these people from South Africa that position themselves as refugees fleeing persecution really are, and why they are leaving South Africa for the US. We will also talk about the real reason and the hidden agenda behind the US decision to grant these people refugee status despite their implementation of restrictive immigration measures. And of course, we will also talk about what this shameful act means for South Africa. Now, without any delay, let's dive straight in. First things first. Who are these white South Africans labeling themselves and known as the Afrikaners? There is still this widely accepted and dominant false historical narrative that Afrikaners are the descendants of Dutch settlers who fled political and religious persecution in Europe. But that claim is a bloody lie, and it also shows that they have always tried and know how to position themselves as the victims. The truth is, they are the descendants of the first European settlers who would later become known as Afrikaners and arrived at the Cape of Good Hope in 1652, led by Jan van Riebeck under the Dutch East India Company. Their mission? To establish a refreshment station for ships traveling between Europe and Asia and not to flee persecution. The Dutch East India Company sent company officials, soldiers, and Boers, that's the Dutch name for farmers, many of whom came for economic opportunity and not sanctuary. There were also a few French Huguenots among them, a Protestant group who were fleeing persecution in Catholic France, but they were quickly assimilated into the Dutch colonial society. Plus, they were a minority and do not define the Afrikaner settler identity as a whole. Later, some Afrikaners, back then known as the Boers, clashed with the British over laws such as the abolition of slavery, and these clashes led to the Great Trek inland. But again, it was not persecution in a global sense. It was more a political dispute between colonizers within a settler colonial society and not a struggle for survival like that faced by colonized Africans. The Boers, particularly the settler farming class, strongly opposed the abolition of slavery by the British in the 1830s because the Boer farmers had heavily relied on slave labor for their agricultural economy. For them, the loss of slave labor was not just an economic blow, it was also a blow to their social dominance and racial hierarchy. The worst part for the Boers was the British, they compensated slave owners, but the compensation had to be claimed in London, making it nearly impossible for most Boers. In response, thousands of Boers left the Cape Colony and embarked on what's now known as the Great Trek. The Great Trek wasn't a quest for freedom as it is celebrated and commemorated in their collective memory up to this day, but it was a reaction to the threat of equality. They had one goal and one goal only: to escape British rule in the Cape Colony and re-establish white settler control inland where they could continue exploiting black labor and maintain their racial order. After the Great Trek, the Boers had established two independent republics inland: the South African Republic, known as Transvaal, and the Orange Free State, which I visited last year on my trip to Oranje to get a better understanding of this whites-only, or let's say Afrikaners-only separatist town in South Africa. But the British wanted control over the entire region, especially after gold was discovered in Transvaal in the end of the 19th century near Johannesburg, and diamonds were already being mined in Kimberley. But the Boers, of course, didn't like that because they wanted to remain independent and white-dominated. The British, on the other hand, wanted to unite South Africa under their rule for economic and strategic reasons. The Boers heavily resisted the annexation of the Transvaal and fought against the British in what is today remembered as the First Boer War, and they won, embarrassing the British Empire big time. But Britain came back with more force, winning the Second Boer War, killing thousands of Boer women and children. Thousands of black South Africans also died, a fact often erased from the narrative. Anyway, the Boers eventually lost the war and were defeated. This war, the trauma of losing independence, farms burned, families in concentration camps, is where the Afrikaner as victim myth was born. And it still echoes today. And I spoke about the power of myths in a different episode. It's absolutely irrelevant whether their myths are fiction, delusion, or real, because what matters in the end is that these myths create realities. And one of these new realities is that they began to see themselves as the victims, as persecuted, even as the chosen people, despite their role as colonizers and slave owners just decades before. And that war trauma was later weaponized to justify apartheid. The narrative of we must protect our people, our land, and our identity became a foundational myth for white supremacy disguised as self-defense. Now, the big question: when did the Boers become the Afrikaners? The term Afrikaners began to gain serious traction in the early 20th century, especially after the Second Boer War. The rebrand from Boer to Afrikaner was basically a post-war strategy for survival. Previously, they were commonly known as the Boers, which means farmers in Dutch, referring mostly to the rural Dutch-descended settler class. But the label Boer was limiting. It evoked a rural, a backward image. Afrikaner, on the other hand, sounded more like a nation builder, like a rightful native of Africa. It was a calculated move to position themselves as indigenous to South Africa. Imagine, despite being settler colonizers. They were basically like, we are not just Dutch descendants, we are Africans. So the term Afrikaner was used to reframe history. No longer invaders, now victims of British imperialism. No longer slave owners, now proud but suffering people. And on top of that, the goal was also to create white solidarity, because the rebrand helped unify the Boers and the Cape Dutch, which were more urban elite settlers. And this newly created identity was later weaponized during apartheid to justify racial segregation and domination. They were saying things like, we must protect Afrikaner culture, or Afrikaners are under threat from the black majority. You see, the myth of Afrikaners fleeing persecution is nothing new, but rather part of a broader strategy, I would say, of white victimhood and historical revisionism. And to me, it's actually quite fascinating how over and over again, they tried to sanitize the role they played in the dispossession of Africans, the dispossession of African land, the establishment of apartheid, and the ongoing racial oppression and violence. And these myths still feed into the claims that we hear today, including the ones behind this recent refugee narrative in the US. But again, the reality is they are not fleeing persecution. If they are truly facing persecution, then show us their burned farms. Where are their mass graves? Who is persecuting them? The reality is that these farm murders that they are allegedly fleeing from are predominantly driven by the country's high overall crime rate, affecting individuals of all races. And guess what? Many victims are black farm workers, a fact that is often overlooked in discussions that focus on white farmers. And on top of that, there have been instances where white farmers have killed their black farm workers. I read about a case where recently, I think it was in 2024, a white farmer and his two employees were accused of murdering two black women and feeding their bodies to pigs. How evil is that? The narrative that farm murders in South Africa are racially motivated is misleading. This isn't about safety, fam. This is about white victimhood. It's about twisting history again, and the US is playing right into it. And let's be honest, the US didn't weaken international refugee law by accident. They weaponized it. Some people believe that Donald Trump is trying to bully South Africa for its stance on Israel. Me personally, I don't believe that this plays a major role in what is happening right now. The US couldn't care less, trust me. They couldn't care less whether South Africa drags Israel to the International Criminal Court. I strongly believe it's about politics, it's about land, it's about power. And the PayPal mafia, the Silicon Valley elite, they see the writings on the wall. Land expropriation in South Africa threatens their interests. If you don't know who I'm talking about and what these guys have to do with what's happening in South Africa, watch this.
Are the PayPal mafia, and how are they linked to apartheid-era South Africa?
Well, there are a group of men who are at the top, the founding of PayPal, all of whom in some way or other grew up in South Africa as children. You've got Musk himself, who was born in South Africa and lived there, went to high school there until he was 18. Musk's grandfather, Canadian grandfather, had been the head of the Canadian branch of a political movement in the 1930s called Technocracy Incorporated, which in essence wanted to scrap democracy in the United States and Canada and have technocrats rule the country, which might sound familiar. That becomes a de facto fascist party, is banned during the Second World War, and then the grandfather moves to apartheid South Africa, having had no connection to the place, in 1950 because he likes the sound of apartheid. And even Errol Musk says of the grandfather, he was an open neo-Nazi. You got Peter Thiel, who was a co-founder with Musk of PayPal. Thiel was born in Germany, but brought to South Africa as a young child. His father was a mining engineer, lived in Johannesburg, and then moved to Southwest Africa, which was then a South African colony, is now Namibia. And he went to school in Swakopmund, which was notorious as probably the last place on the planet where people still openly greeted each other with Heil Hitler and celebrated Hitler's birthday. He went to a German school there before moving to the United States when he was 10 or 11. You've got David Sachs, who was born in Cape Town. He's big in PayPal and is now Trump's AI and crypto czar. He moved to Tennessee as a relatively young child, but grew up in the white South African diaspora there. And you've got Roelof Botha, the grandson of Pik Botha, the last foreign minister of apartheid South Africa. He was the acceptable face of apartheid. You'll remember he used to run around the United States trying to put a gloss on how they were reforming things and that everything was getting better. So you see those four key people at the top of PayPal, and they all have this, very intimate connection to South Africa.
You see, these people, trust me, if they could introduce apartheid in the US, they would have done it yesterday. There is absolutely no doubt about it. I mean, has anyone noticed the tie that Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landau was wearing when he welcomed the Afrikaner refugees? It's orange, white and blue, the colors of South Africa's former flag under apartheid. That already says enough. Now, the big question is, what does this mean for South Africa? The genocide narrative that is currently being pushed by Donald Trump and his administration is a game. And in my honest opinion, South Africans should stop trying so hard to defend themselves against these shameless allegations. Donald Trump and his people are not dumb. They're not stupid. They know that it's false. They just don't care. They use it as a pretext to undermine South Africa's progress, to divide, to distract, and to destabilize. But when it comes to these so-called refugees, let them go. Honestly, this is actually good news. Good riddance, because it's the real racists that are leaving. This isn't a loss. This is a cleansing, a perfect example of the trash taking itself out. Imagine, these are folks who couldn't even make apartheid work for them. They failed with a system that was built to benefit them. What do you think they'll do in America? Please, Trump, come and get more of these losers, I beg. Best believe, wealthy and successful Afrikaners aren't leaving. They're not done losing their mind. The ones with land, power and connections, they are of course staying. And let's be clear, not every white South African is part of this narrative. There are many who are working daily for a fair and equal South Africa. And guess what? This US move hurts them too, because it paints them all with the same brush. It divides intentionally. South Africans must stand firm now and not allowed to be bullied by an orange clown. Trump is using power, not morality, not justice, power, and so must Africans, strategically, economically, and politically. Land expropriation without compensation is not an option, it's a necessity. It's the foundation of any real transformation in South Africa. Because I truly believe that without land, there is no sovereignty, there is no dignity, there is no justice. This move by the US accepting white South Africans as refugees is, I believe, a direct pushback against that transformation. But again, South Africa must and will stand firm. The US cannot stop the unstoppable. And as for the losers who left and who decide to leave in the future, please, South Africa, make sure they will never enter again. No re-entry, not even for a visit, please. It's funny to see that the US is really getting the weakest links right now. These losers are leaving South Africa because of the economic opportunities that the US promised them. I honestly don't know how much more has to happen for Black Americans who voted for Trump to finally wake up. I mean, can't you see that their shamelessness, their caucasity, and their greed knows no bounds? As if positioning themselves as the victims is not shameless enough. Imagine with all their privilege, they now go as far as to even steal and appropriate the refugee status from the most vulnerable who are fleeing real persecution and experiencing real genocide. I have no words left. Really, I'm speechless. Anyway, let me know how you think about this in the comments below, how you feel about this whole BS that is going on right now. And I look forward to see you in the next video. Bye.